Lots of people like to see what's inside the book. And over the last couple of months during the summer of 2016, I have been compiling sketches for a new Fairy Houses and Fairy Doors books, volume 3 and 4. And lots of people like to see the flip throughs. So what I'm going to be showing you today is actually the raw pictures before they've been scanned as they are in my sketchbook. And so I hope you enjoy the flip through. Here's a little guy that's a watchman who's heard a noise and has come out and investigating. Here's an attic fairy with a house that has been created out of a basket. Here's a little door next to the main door with a little gargoyle figure in the top. Here's a book nook with a lovely view of the lake with a little bitty fairy house door in the bottom of the bookcase. Here's a little potato critter out in the woods with a little fairy looking over his shoulder and a little squirrel up front. Beautiful leaves in the front yard. Here's the entrance to a house where there's a little hidden fairy door under the steps and a little critter, house elf, welcoming you to his home. Little Mother Hubbard had a shoe full of children, or was that the little old lady who had a shoe full of children? Here's a mystical creature in the bushes waiting for the little fairies to come out of the door by the big door. Here's a little older fairy looking over or maybe repairing his house. Here's a little troll critter up on top of a wall watching out for things coming down the road with some ginkgo leaves in the background. Here's some pretty beautiful flowers with a forest critter that is sitting on a stump waiting for this little fairy to go inside and discover if this little hole in the tree is the best place for him to build his fairy home. Here's a little lizard, dragon, gargoyle, whatever you might want to call it, watching out for the little fairies that are living behind this fairy door. Here's a little bunny butt. He got scared, so he ran into the log, but here's some fairies in the background along with some beautiful irises. Here's the mushroom farmer. He goes out and makes sure the mushrooms and the ferns are well cultivated. Here's a gourd house that has a swing on the end that a little fairy can swing back and forth on. Here's a giant dragon crawling over the wall to see who's there looking at him. Very decorative design for the scroll work for the big door that is mimicked in the fairy door. And look at the little contemplation garden, the Zen garden. Here's a fairy that's gone out to relax on the rocks in her front yard, and here's a little toad watching out for her, and a little fawn looking over the house to see what's there. There's a little oriental door with the little icons that are the good luck charms for travelers and children who are sick, along with dogwood blossoms and the little Zen garden right next to the fairy house in the front. Here's a drawing of a wall with the leaves and beautiful brickwork. And here's stairs up into the attic. Who all remembers going up into the attic to see what treasures lay ahead? Here's a Japanese garden with steps going up into the background, and a tiny little house and pine cones and a little fox and a mystical forest creature. Here's what's at the top of the attic stairs. It's a box with a little fairy home in it, a little spider web and a spider. Here's a Chinese entrance through a wall with a tiny little bitty fairy house near the front, And again, the little icon for wishing luck to travelers and overseeing ill children. Here's a little fairy who's flying around. She must have come out of her little fairy house here at the bottom. And here's a little fairy home that has steps up to a nice little deck so they can look out onto the backyard. And the fairy's up there looking around to see who's going to be peeking at her. Here's another one, Chinese garden with the moon gate and a dragon overseeing it, and a little tiny little fairy moon gate on the left. Here's a lily pad house with a little frog on the lily pad, little fairies, bees, and all kinds of lotus pods. Here's one at the end of the forest path with little planks going up to stairs to the door, and this fairy must think she's in a beauty contest because she's posing. Another attic fairy with a little fairy house built into a trunk. Little spider webs in the back and a nice antique chair in front, and she must be hiding. She's very coy. Can you see the forest creature in this one? There might not be any fairies posing about, but there is a critter. Here's a little fairy who's cultivating some flowers in front of the garden shed, and she's got a little house down here at the bottom. Here's a little mouse and a little weasel and a little fairy. So they must be up in some climbs where the roof has to be shaped this way. And there's some dogwood blossoms in the background. Now we move to the beach. Here's some leaves that have been pulled up in front so they can have a nice little dry path to get into their little driftwood home. And here's the fairy doing some more work on his house. And here's a little fairy house that is inside a garden statuary, the little icon, and here's a snail, and somewhere in this picture there's a surprise, but you have to look very hard. When you're in the city, it's much harder to hide if you're a fairy. Can you see him in the tree? Here's another attic fairy. They have built their home into the wainscoting of the upstairs attic. So there's lots of boards and wood that's going to be fun to color. And here's some little opossums looking over the ridge here. A little fairy, and can you see the forest creature? And some little dogwoods in the bottom right-hand corner. And this little fairy house is out on a tiny little island for protection. And there's some nice, sweet little koi that are in the water around them protecting the fairy. And here's a little fairy who is peeking in on its neighbors. Do you see the hummingbird? And what about the apple pie that is getting cool in the kitchen window? When you go upstairs in your house, do you look around for fairies? This fairy house has a door right at the landing. Here's another forest creature who's looking over a couple of empty stumps and logs, and the little deer is peeking up to see what is the fairy creature doing. This trunk was taken over by fairies to create a little fairy home. And this is a specially designed fairy home out in the woods. You see the waterfalls and the water coming around into other waterfalls. And the fairy's so happy she's doing a little dance. Here's a fox overseeing the mushroom home. And there's a fairy who's making friends with the fox. And this fairy's rather large and may not fit inside this home, but he's making his rounds to make sure his little friends are okay. and the stag comes with him as his horse. This little fairy is inviting you into her home. You see the little fireplace and the braided rug, and they're very environmentally conscious because they have a rain gutter with water that goes into the barrel. Here's another gourd home, and they're so delighted to be inside. They have nice little rug around the bottom, and they have some beautiful roses, although they are a little bit thorny. And there is a mystery creature in this one. Can you see him? And it's not the ladybug, it's another one. And here's another Chinese influenced door with the little fairy door that goes right with it. And this was inspired by a lantern that was turned into a fairy house. Notice all the grapes and the grape leaves. We're back to the seashore. It looks like the fairies have been building little sand castles, and they're using the ship's wheels as the entranceway to their door and shells for their roof. Here's a beautiful city door that has little spider webs in it and little critters and a fairy hiding. We're back to the seashore. Can you see the little critters peeking over the horizon? There's a pier with a little shack and a little boat. The praying mantis has come along, and he's playing with the fairy who's playing with the butterfly, and there's a little caterpillar in the background. And look at the ladybug and all the wonderful pine cones and little spiders and mushrooms. Wouldn't this make a great picture to color? And you know, fairies can't always get around on their wings. Sometimes they need a little help. So this is a fairy caravan wagon. And look, there's a little fairy door in the fairy caravan. Bleeding Hearts flowers. There's a caterpillar up there that the fairy is working with. Maybe they're trying to train them to do something fun. And there's a little hammock over here. Castles are always romantic. And if you have beautiful flowers in front and a fairy that is tending the flowers, you'd have a very nice home. And fairies can use pine cones as their roofing shingles and pieces of wood bark. And look at the fairy critter, the forest critter that's watching over the home. Here's another house that's been planted right in the middle of the fern patch. There's little spider webs. There's specially constructed window cross braces. There's a little lantern hanging by a chain by the front porch. And there's a little fairy peeking out from the window. We're back to Japan and the beautiful Japanese gardens and the garden statuary. This looks like it must be a very well-to-do elf or fairy living here, because they've got beautiful stairs and special doors and lattice work over the front. The tortoise who moves so slow is just absolutely enamored of this beautiful little fairy, and some beautiful calla lilies in the background. Don't worry, the snake is not there to bite or hurt you. He's there to warm up against the nice little fairy house, who has a balcony to come out to see the snake and chat with them when they want to. Can you see the hidden fairy? Another castle and a fairy door, and this little fairy guy is out there walking through the beautiful, beautiful flowers that are in front of the castle windows. Here's a little house where the little snail crawled all the way up on the roof, and then the little frog is peeking out at you, and another little frog is precariously balanced on the edge of a leaf. Do you see the fairy peeking around from the side? Now this is a mushroom hill. Can you see the forest creature in this one? Lots of rocks and mushrooms and leaves to color. Won't this just be wonderful? Here's some starburst flowers that are dripping with the old Spanish moss. So they must be down in Louisiana. There's a little owl looking out from a hole in the tree. There's a snail getting its little tentacles or antenna polished by the elf, who's very happy to help. Here's another tortoise and a doe, fawn, and a butterfly, and some beautiful little sunflowers, all leading up and in front of a fairy door that looks like it's going into a wall. Can you see the hidden fairy? There's another little house that looks like it might be made by mud, and it's got a contemplation garden. Can you see this? You go in and you go around and around and around as you meditate. And it's got flowers in the window box, and there's a hidden fairy. Can you find her? Here's a strange looking little house, but that's okay. Fairies have a lot of imagination. There's lots of bugs in this one. I see an ant, a spider, and a dragonfly, and a fairy. And there's some very intricate pine needle leaves behind the house, and some little pine nuts. Here's a mushroom house. Ooh, look at that beetle. Isn't that interesting? And a little troll guy behind him, and a very tall fairy. She must be of a different species than the other little hidden fairy. Another castle. Look at those gorgeous star flowers. Won't this be wonderful to color? Do you see the bee? We're back to the city. Some beautiful trellised trees in front of a regular door that has a fairy door built in. Can you see the forest creature? It's a little hard to find, but she's there. We're back to the beach, and the little beach fairy is looking around to see what's up. Do you see the name of this boat? It's ready to go out as soon as somebody raises the sail, and it's leaning up against a little fairy house made of sand and other shells. And this was in an abandoned house where the trees and the berries and the stairs and the flowers just took over the staircase. And there's a snail deciding he's going to go up the staircase, and a little fairy cheering him on. Here's a little troll critter that's having fun with a froggy. Do you see the little fairy peeking out? Lots of pine cones and mushrooms and old tree trunks. Here's another fairy house that's on a rock right across in the middle of a river. Do you see the tortoise talking to the butterfly and the little elf waving to them both? Won't that koi be great to color? And you see the waves, so you'll have to paint this or color this as water that the koi is underneath. Here's a little forest critter. Isn't he a cute little fairy? Lots of ferns and a little squirrel with a nut. And look at the cricket at the bottom. Won't he be fun to color? Here's another house shoe, or a shoe house. And look at the bee and the dandelion and all the flowers around. Do you see the little fairy? He's like overwhelmed with how big that bee is. Here's another house with a mushroom bottom, but it's got a hay roof. There's a little froggy hanging from the top. He's curious and looking around at you. And there's the fairy. Here's another tree out in the woods with the ginkgo leaves in the background, some beautiful irises in front, and a gorgeous little door with special hinges. You may or may not see a fairy in this one. Not every single picture in these books have a fairy, but you can always draw one in yourself. Ooh, look at that big beetle and the dragonfly having a little conversation. And this fairy looks like he's near the beach, and here's some beach grass and shells and the butterfly. This is a real simple one for those who just want something very simple. It's the house, fairy house surrounded by flowers. Oh, isn't this lovely? All kinds of shapes and organic lines surrounded by vines and leaves and flowers. And can you see the little fairy in this one? Ah, this one's so cute. He's peeking around the edge of the trunk. And this is a specially made house because it's built out from the tree trunk. Looks like they've put a lot of work into these little roofing elements. See the little snail at the bottom? Here's another one with the special English trellised windows and the special shingles. Gorgeous iris and big steps. Won't this be fun to color? Here's a bee who's mistaking this fairy house for a beehive. And there's the fairy. Lovely flowers. Here's another simple house with very simple flowers, lots of little complicated leaves in the back, but the fairy is having fun on their little swing. And here's a little stone house built into the side of the hill with some sunflower or daisies in the background for the little doe in the front, and a little critter looking up trying to see what's over the grass. Here's another little log house with the pine cone shingles and a little squirrel and a fairy. Do you see the forest creature? Here's another house that's sort of like a tree house. There's some deer in the back, a spider and a fairy and a little snail. And look at the little mouse peeking over the flowers. Ah, it's almost a castle, but not quite. Almost a mushroom house, but not quite. Lots of flowers, a little chipmunk on the log, a giant praying mantis. Can you see the fairy? Oh, this is a strange little critter. It's sort of like a cross between a troll and an elf and a cat and maybe an otter. And it's looking at this house and maybe having a philosophical conversation with a little elf up on the branch. And here's some more tree houses. Look at all the little windows in this strange tree. Do you see the forest creature? This is against the tree where there looks like there's some little condos going on. Little steps going up to each of the doors that have leaves as window shades, and at least 2 fairies and a butterfly in this one. Here's a very simple little house that's out in the sunshine with some beautiful flowers and some little fruits that are on the edge. And this bunny is peeking around at the corner of the house wondering what's on the other side. Do you see the fairy? Little flowers in the flower boxes. And we've got another hummingbird and some beautiful flowers and leaves and the little fairy looking over the hummingbird's shoulder. And here's some white birch trees with a little frog peeking up at the spider and a little fairy flying nearby. Beautiful fall leaves. Won't this make a gorgeous picture for some earth-toned colors? Here's another pseudo mushroom house. The little fairies on top looking over the edge of the roof at the sunset. Some gorgeous flowers in the background, and it looks like the 2 bees are having a conversation with each other. Their legs are loaded with pollen, so you might want to color that yellow. And here's a tree in some ferns. A little fairy looking up at the little ladybug, having some fun. And here's another tree trunk house with a little lizard and the fairy out on the front door with some nice maple leaves in the background. So this is the pictures and the flip through from the Fairy Houses and Fairy Doors by Dawn D. Boyer. I hope you looked at and loved the pictures that are in the book, and join me in purchasing the books from Amazon. The titles of the books are Big Kids Coloring Book, Fairy Houses and Fairy Doors, Volume 3 and Volume 4.